But I want to start out with they're going on a hunting trip. They're making a plan, or they've made a plan. And I have to say, for somebody like me, it would probably drive me a little bit nuts. You know, they start out with this idea of we're going tomorrow, the next morning. You know, on page 38, Brody says that the next morning came several times before we set out in the direction of Bluestone. Several individuals said they would come, but did not. Others said they would not come, but did. Eventually, some people start going and they're hunting. So you have this, on the one hand, it looks kind of like a, how to say, it looks kind of disorganized. It looks like no one has a plan. No one's wearing a watch or anything. But on the other hand, something amazing happens as they go off in their own directions. They're all off hunting, and then all of a sudden, they all show up at this fishing spot. No time had been appointed for a rendezvous. Indeed, clock time is of no significance here. Only Joseph had a watch, and it was never used for hunting purposes. Everyone nonetheless appeared from the woods and converged on the fishing spot within minutes of one another. So somehow, even though things might appear to us to be haphazard, there seems to be a coordination of skilled activities during this time. And so I asked you to look a little bit at that section on page 37 and the way in which Brody is going a little bit, I might say, back and forth on this when he's talking about decisions and plans. So, Gabe, what kind of decisions are these? Let's do Brody. Let's stick with Brody. What kind of a decision are they making?
They're like deciding to. So he has this real like planning versus action. So like they're planning out the trip, and then like during the hunt things change. So Brody's like they're taking in new information and then evaluating their plan during the hunting trip.
Yeah, he says that, you know, the decision is taken in the doing, which, I mean, you'd have to admit, if somebody said, I'm making my decision as I do it, we might call into question whether that's really making a decision, right? And in fact, he basically says that. He says, well, it's not properly even termed a decision, because, hey, you know, if you're just doing something, then you can't really say that it's a decision. And the same thing with plan. He gets really confused about plan. He's got plan and quote plan. If a plan constitutes a decision about the right procedure or action, and the decision is congruent with the action, then there is no space left for a plan, only for a bundle of open-ended and non-rational possibilities, which, you know, doesn't really sound like a plan or a decision. It sounds like a bundle of open-ended and non-rational possibilities. So, I mean, I think that it might make us wonder why then Brody has to kind of wrestle with this idea of a decision or a plan. And for this, I think that we should think about a longer debate, a debate that even precedes the formation of anthropology itself, and has to do with the Spanish conquest of of what they called the New World, the new territories, and to a famous debate or a kind of what is now called a dispute or a debate from 1550, which Brody describes on page 50 of Maps and Dreams, between Las Casas and Sepúlveda, two Spanish monks. And the debate is basically about whether or not the inhabitants of the Americas, the inhabitants of Spain's new territories, have a system, a way of life, enough intelligence, enough a place, a sort of enough rationality, you might say, that should be respected. And Bartolomé de las Casas was arguing that they did. And Brody mentions here a book by Louis Hankey. Brody mentions Aristotle and the American Indian. This cover is a different book by the same author called All Mankind is One. I think a phrase attributed to Las Casas, and it is about this disputation. And the reason I bring this up is because these issues in some ways continue with us to the present, which is to say, you know, to what extent are people being rational? To what extent do they have a system which should be respected? How should we treat other people? Also, it's probably worth noting that oftentimes, and the Spaniards are depicted as sort of uniformly terrible in their conquest of their territories and their treatment of the inhabitants. And in some ways, there was pushback on this ideas, and there were different perspectives within the Americas as well as within the Spaniards as to what should be done in these territories. So Brody, in some ways, has to talk, or he has to phrase his argument in terms of, you know, to what extent are people rational, or to what extent can they make plans, or can they make decisions? And this echoes, in fact, another different debate which comes up at the beginning of Ingold, which I want to briefly mention, in part because this is hardcore history of anthropological thought stuff. Argonauts of the Western Pacific by Bronislaw Malinowski, which Ingold quotes here, seen as perhaps one of the very first truly anthropological ethnographies. And certainly when I got to graduate school, the very first book that I read in anthropology, Malinowski's Argonauts. Research was done for this during the 1910s, around World War I. And as Ingold says here, there was a debate about Malinowski dismissed as preposterous the assumption that man should be actuated by pure economic motives of enlightened self-interest. So for reasons that are probably not the best, Malinowski was dismissing the idea that the people of this status would be economic calculators. On the other hand, one of his students, Raymond Firth, was someone who was arguing that there was a keen discussion of alternatives and of debating about economic advantage and disadvantage. And so Firth was arguing that, in fact, people were very rationally economic, even and perhaps even more in what we might call primitive, or in this case, peasant societies. Now, I would say that, this debate, which Ingold rightly calls an old debate, and it keeps resurfacing up until at least the 1960s, we probably shouldn't get too down on Malinowski for assuming that people were not rational, because in fact, you could also argue that Firth's position, or the position that everyone is a rational economic man, reduces everybody to the same standard of kind of Western, it reduces everyone to a same standard of Western economic interest and self-interest. And so at least Malinowski was, in his own way, there he is, promoting the Argonauts of the Western Pacific. He was holding out the notion that people could have very different cultural values and standards. And so we might not be happy with how Malinowski phrases his dismissal of the idea of this, but we might take a cue from the idea that people may not always have these self-interested values, and that they might have different, and one might say even better values. Because this old debate was perhaps never resolved. We'll come back to it a little bit later. In some ways, I think everybody just started to assume, well, people are always rational, but in pursuit of their own different cultural values. And so we left it at that, although it wasn't a completely satisfactory resolution of the debate if we want to talk about sort of ultimate efficiencies. So again, going back to Brody, and this is a slide I showed from last time, Brody's in a fix here because he has to somehow present the people that he's studying as rational types. Otherwise, why even bother? So he has to talk about them as being rational, as perhaps making decisions and having plans, and present that in such a way that a government bureaucrat might say, aha, that's a rational activity. And so he's fighting against a long tradition of denying that the indigenous peoples had a system, that they had skills, and that they even had humanity. And in this section of the book, he goes through this sort of some historical episodes in the denial of indigenous humanity. And he takes us back into the fur trade, in which it might be called sort of an original, some of the original exploitative relationships that were established was, when the settlers wanted fur. But Brody notes here that, yes, there was an exploitative relationship. There was a lot of liquor being doled out in order to kind of to enhance the exploitation of the relationship, you might say. But you at least needed people to do the trapping and to get the furs and to do the trading. And so even though the fur trade was an exploitative relationship, you needed the skills of the peoples in the area, the indigenous people, in order to carry it out. Whereas when people began to come in by train and began to try and turn the land from the hunting and the trapping to agriculture, there became the idea that the indigenous skills didn't matter anymore. Didn't matter, and in fact, they have to give way. It's not efficient. It's not efficient to hunt and to gather, and so you have to yield or perish, as Brody put it. And then if you sort of then fast forward into the now, or close to the present, and this is, I think, an idea that people have about Native Americans, indigenous people in our own society, is the idea that, well, they may have been okay, or they were great back then, but they're either gone, they're not around, or they're doomed. They can't have a system in the present. And so this is what Brody is fighting, or kind of trying to put his ethnography against, are these ongoing history ideas of denying the viability and the systematicity of indigenous peoples. And so I think that's one of the reasons why he has to talk in these terms of being rational and being people that make plans and decisions. So we fast forward a little bit to our present situation. Unlike back in the day of when Las Casas was disputating with Sepúlveda, most of us, I think most people, believe that hunter-gatherers are rational, or that we share a kind of rationality, or that we're not as mean about things, you might say. And so Brody has a quote in which he explicitly uses this term, that hunting for large animals is the most efficient, the most rational activity for anyone who lives in the boreal forest. So in certain environments, I think we would be willing to admit that, especially in ones where you can't grow wheat and things like that, that this is a rational thing to do. But if we turn back then to the to Ingold's chapter and this debate about who's being rational or not, if we look at the non-human animals, the muskrats and the bear and all the animals that are living in this forest, they also seem to be carrying out a strategy that is like we have mapped out for the hunter-gatherers. So are we to conclude then that the non-human animals in this environment are also rational? Are we talking about, as Ingold puts it later on page 32, the economic muskrat or the rational bear? They seem to be following a very similar system of economic maximization when looked at from the models of resource use and where you should spend your time. So we end up in a kind of a strange situation where we have the idea of rationality, which is supposed to be something that humans have, but are we supposed to then extend that also to these other forest creatures? Are they all being rational? We would, of course, say no. We would say, no, they are not being rational. That's what humans do. They must be adapted to their environment. And so for the non-human animals, of course, we think of that as a product of natural selection over time. But the same argument has been marshaled to or applied to human hunter-gatherers. And this is kind of a mirror image. Ingold has a nice figure of this on page 28, figure 2.1. It's where he's saying that in some ways, the idea that people are adapted to their environment is the mirror image of economic rationality. But if we're making a natural selection argument, then we can't have rationality. You don't think about natural selection. You don't have to have any choices, and you don't really need a culture or a society. And I think that one of my favorite parts of your reflection, Willa, you said that Ingold wants us to know that this is wrong. And so, he gets very adamant about this, and we'll go into it a little bit. But, in this model, those things that come from human society, what we might call culture or thinking or thought or society, rationality might be a distortion of the natural selection stuff, because humans are weird and sometimes we want to, have big feasts when we should be spreading our energy out over time, or we want to have too much sugar when we should be eating a paleo diet or something like that. So in this sense, our cultural objectives, as Ingold says on page 31 with his own exclamation point, the blame for this discrepancy is placed squarely upon culture itself, because human behavior is not optimal in the sense of being adapted to your environment. So we end up with this, like I said, this kind of mirror image conundrum where you have rational choice models and natural selection models converging on the same model, but getting at it in different ways, and in both cases, basically denying that humans have an influence, or we might say agency or choices in their environment. And so what Ingold is saying here is that if people are being rational, which means they have choices, and those choices might have alternatives, then we're not going to be able to make an appeal to natural selection. That would be rather absurd. On the other hand, if we're going to have a natural selection model, and in this case, Ingold's argument gets a little bit more involved, and he takes a shot at biologists who should know better. He says that if you're going to have a true human natural selection model, you have to somehow describe not just that this hunters or whoever you're describing is going to be more reproductively successful, but that somehow that reproductive success is being encoded in a plan for the next generation. And sort of it's a complicated argument, but I think it boils down to this, that oftentimes people say, oh, look, that person has been more successful, or that organism is being more successful because they're having more offspring. But that could be complete chance. That doesn't mean anything's necessarily being passed along into the next generation. And so, what Ingold is arguing here is that that behavior has to contribute to a set of instructions for the next generation to follow. Otherwise, it doesn't really encode anything. It's resulted in a reproductive differential, but that doesn't mean you're passing anything along. And there's a whole sub-argument here about the genetic innateness of some of this stuff. Ingold is saying quite correctly that nobody who was studying the hunter-gatherers was actually talking about a genetic model of passing hunting skills along, but rather that the cultural model worked similarly to what we might expect from natural selection. So again, we end up in a kind of dilemma here, because Ingold is arguing against the rational economic actor theories, and he's also telling us why those natural selection adaptation theories are wrong. And so he's arguing against both of these, but he doesn't want to say that people are irrational, because that's not a good thing to do. And he doesn't want to say that people are unskilled. And he in fact wants to remind us of the skills and the patterns and the ways in which humans are very adapted and rational in their environment. And it reminded me of something in Brody, which is on pages 44 and 45, when they talk about hunters and dreamers. And they're explaining to Brody that some people could locate, some great hunters could locate their prey in dreams, find their trails, and make a dream kill, and then a few days later do that, or what we might say in real life. Re-encounter the animal and collect the kill. They could just collect the kill. And then, as they say, maybe you think this is all nonsense, just so much bullshit. Maybe you don't think this power is possible. Few people understand. And so they say that, you know, white people and young people laugh at such skills, but they don't know. So I'm drawing your attention to this for one thing. We're going to later on read a chapter in Ingold about dreaming and about how people do things in dreams. But for right now, I just want to emphasize that, you know, when people talk in this way, often others, bureaucrats, you might say, the state, is tempted to dismiss those as stories, as old time, as things that are proof that people are not being rational, or are not being skilled in their environment. So we have to be very careful always when arguing against models of rational economic actors or natural selection, or I mean adaptation, not to say that people are violating those norms. In general, Ingold is arguing against this kind of model making that would abstract from people's behavior, or create an abstract model, measure it against the world, and then say that the model or the abstraction must be the reason for why people are behaving the way they do. And this actually even applies to the idea of culture in general as this independent body of context-free knowledge. For Ingold, he says that culture exists only in the heads of anthropological theorists that way. That is to say that, sure, we can describe what people are doing, but we shouldn't get into some sort of notion that abstraction was the source of their behavior. So what alternative do we have, or what might be the other way of doing things? So Ingold is against this idea that we can simply download a bunch of representations and rules. He says that there is no explicit code of procedure. So what do we get instead? How do these hunters learn things? Willa, what would you say?
Last time, you have to develop through learning with someone who knows better, and with the environment, you have to develop the skills in order to kind of see everything in context, and then make. I can't what I wrote already.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely correct that it very much aligns with what we were talking about in the last class. It is a system of apprenticeship. You go out hunting with the people that you know, with experienced hunters, and you learn things in the context. And so it is not transmission of representations, but an education of attention. And again, really interesting comparison with what Brody was saying. So if you remember, Brody is making maps of people's hunting areas with the hunters themselves drawing these maps. And, you know, he's asking them, he's like, hey, wait a second, you know, he's talking to Stan and Brian about, and he's like, well, your circle looks like, you know, looks like Atson's circle. And so, you know, they kind of get puzzled and angry at him because they said, hey, we were all there together. We were kids, but we were going around hunting together. Are you trying to say that we're not, in Brody's words, did I suppose the young men were not Indians? Was I saying that they weren't skilled like their elders? So in fact, what Brody is saying matches very much up with what Ingold's saying, that we learn, and especially in this case, in terms of a relationship, in terms of actually aligning our movements and our touch and our real world sensibilities as an education of attention, so that there is no abstract knowledge, or no, it's not that there's no abstract knowledge, that you have to have that that insight application of the knowledge in order to make it work. And so on pages 37 to 38 is why I said in some ways this aligns pretty well as a kind of parallel yet perhaps more sophisticated explanation of what Brody is saying. Ingold says that the accomplished hunter consults the world, not representations inside his head. And I guess I will say, brief caveat back to what we were talking about in the last class. Oftentimes we do need to pay attention to the gendered aspects of this apprenticeship, but at least in terms of what is going on in the learning of it, we can think about this as a general way in which humans have learned over time as being situated. And at the end of this chapter, it's perhaps one of my favorite quotes in all of Ingold's book, is about the idea that the scientist is looking at the hunter-gatherer from across the boundary of nature. And so he's talking about, you know, this idea that there's all these models and abstractions which the scientist is comparing the hunter-gatherer to. And as Ingold says here, far from confronting one another across the boundary of nature. So again, this idea that on one side there's the scientist and abstract reason, and on the other side, the ambiguous hunter-gatherer in the world of nature. Both the people who call themselves scientists, and the people whom scientists call hunter-gatherers. So what Ingold is saying here is that we have both people who scientists have called hunter-gatherers, and we have people who call themselves scientists, and all of them, both of them, all of us are fellow passengers in this world of ours who carry on in the business of life and develop our capacities, etc. So that, in some ways, this is a description of how we all learn and how we all live and how we are all making decisions and making plans. We're both those who think of themselves as abstract scientists and those who scientists have studied are trying to involve ourselves in our environments and with human and non-human actors. And so Ingold is saying that we have to take this sort of immersed, involved condition as our point of departure. But then he says that to do that, we're going to have a fundamental overhaul of the Darwinian paradigm. He says this a couple different times. At the very end, the fundamental overhaul of evolutionary theory, or back at the beginning, near the beginning, the problem lies at the heart of the Darwinian paradigm. We have to go back and re-examine the whole Darwinian paradigm so that we can get to a place in which you don't have these independently specified, genetically specified organisms confronting a environment which is also independently specified, but we have both organisms and environment developing each other, actively involved in a larger evolutionary process, which would be awesome. It would be great to think this way, so we can get to a genuinely ecological approach, a truly ecological perspective. That chapter, this chapter, was written, well, the book is over 20 years old. Chapter 2. It came out I forget when it came out. Even before that. In any case, how has this worked out? Let me just check on chapter 2. (1994). Wow. Almost 30 years ago. If I march up to Johnstone and start talking about a fundamental overhaul of evolutionary theory and the Darwinian paradigm, what's going to happen to me? Huh? Boo. Yeah. You remember that Augustine Fuentes thing we read in cultural anthropology where he took a few small, he's just trying to locate Darwin in his historical context, just a tiny bit, just a little bit of, hey, this person couldn't escape the prejudices of his time, even though he was a great, brilliant scientist. I mean, that's what Fuentes' point was, right? And Augustine Fuentes has himself been trying to do some of this. He's been really into the idea of niche construction and trying to think about how organisms are actively involved in their own evolution. But my goodness, you get a lot of blowback, just a huge amount. If you say anything about Darwin, man, you might as well